Hey, changemakers! Thank you for tuning into the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. I'm your fervent feminist host, Raven O'Neill, and I get the honors of sitting down weekly with diverse experts from all walks of life to explore ideas, opportunities, and strategies that we can all use to hack our way to better lives within patriarchal societies. If you're ready to hack patriarchal systems and structures, I invite you to join us and help move the needle. I am thrilled and honored to welcome back my very first guest ever, Dawn Bowes. Dawn is the owner of Become Coaching and loves helping people realize their wildest dreams, create a balanced and meaningful life, and uplevel their careers without the stress. She has spent the majority of her career in education and wellness industries, gaining experiences in areas such as burnout recovery, wellness, and career coaching. While counseling and career coaching are her primary job functions by day, Dawn also enjoys traveling, learning new things, and trying great food. Let's come together and offer Dawn the warmest welcome. All right, I am excited for today's episode. It is the first episode of 2025, and I'm here with Dawn Bowes, my very first guest on this podcast ever. And I'm excited to have a conversation because we're going to kick off this year's season this year. And we're going to really look at hacking the patriarchy, where it has been, where it's going, but also kind of the state of politics, because they kind of bleed together. So I guess kicking it off, we can dive into a conversation about kind of where this podcast has been and where it's going. So I would love for you to introduce yourself, and then we'll dive into that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. My name is Dawn Bowes. I am a therapist and a coach, and I work primarily with women who are experiencing burnout, because a lot of folks, especially entrepreneurs or business and career-focused women who have a lot of perfectionism, a lot of anxiety, a lot of people-pleasing, what a lot of us have is undiagnosed ADHD. And so it's just really a matter of like, how can we reclaim our time? How can we reclaim our energy? And from that point, how do we then create, now that, all the fires are out and now that we have more time, how can we use that and leverage that to create the life that we want? And so I am thrilled to be here and to chat with you. My background is in social work, and so a lot of social justice orientation throughout my entire career, and just really looking forward at this next 4 years to see how we can best stay sustainable, keeping our energy, keeping our joy, keeping our positivity so that we can make it through.
Timely topic, because you work in burnout, and I feel like in 2 weeks, we're going to be very burned out. So I guess I'll roll it back. For anyone that's just tuning in now, the history of this podcast is that I launched it with the idea of offering hacks to women so that they could really thrive, ideally thrive, maybe just survive the patriarchal society we live in. This year, I'm really pushing for that to not just be women, but diverse individuals. I feel like if you are not your cis white gender man, then even those people are part of the patriarchy. They suffer from the patriarchy too. So really looking at, again, that history of it was for women, and now I just want to make sure that the guests I have, the voices I speak to, and the hacks that we present are for all diverse individuals. Going on from there, let's start out with the current political climate. I launched this in 2024, not knowing where we were going to be today, and just out of passion. I knew that I wanted to make it a weekly podcast at the end of last year, before I had really sunk in what we're looking at for the next 4 years. And so the current political climate is going to affect this podcast. Even I had a moment yesterday, I was like, maybe I should be afraid. Maybe the conversations I'm having and the guests that I'm having, maybe I should have a little bit of fear. But to stay silent would be adding to the problem, maybe.
I think it's important for us to remember that part of the political strategy is flooding. And so we're seeing a lot of the same stuff that we saw at the beginning of the last administration, except this time they're a lot more organized because the Trump administration is who I mean by they had a plan coming in, and they have a plan to implement that with some skilled folks. And so I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now with like changes to return to work, changes within the NIH. Where are they hiding data, and like specifically with bird flu, and then rolling back DEI, and now they've added an A for accessibility, which is not something that I've seen before, especially from this particular political viewpoint. And so yeah, recognizing that we are going to get burnt out if we watch everything, because that's the intention behind this strategy. And so like both a sprint and a marathon are two different ways to get somewhere, and both of them require a different strategy. And so if we want to sprint, we have to remember that we have to rest in order to make it to the end. And then marathoning means going slower, making sure that we're staying paced, making sure that our bodies are healthy and well fed. But I don't ascribe to the fear piece, because fear to me wastes energy that we could be using, to follow in Killer Mike and all of his activism from Atlanta. Now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. And for me, when I'm operating from a place of fear, I don't think as clearly. I'm a little bit more like closed off, less willing to engage with other folks. And to your point about making sure that this space honors the intersectionality of feminism, I can't hold space for fear for me and how I'm acting in this new administration. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree wholly. What's funny is that my next question was going to be, obviously I had a moment where I thought, should I be afraid? Which there is my privilege showing, because I'm not, and maybe I should be, I'm not sure. But I am currently, if we're talking about today, operating from a place of anger, which I don't know is any better. We had a quick moment offline where I said, I am at that point today where I'm like, burn it down. What is happening?
I think honoring how you feel in this moment, I think that's also valid. Fear, anger, frustration, everything, I think it has its place. Just for me, it's not something that I'm going to pay a lot of attention to. When I see these emotions coming up in myself, I've just got to let it flow through and treat it like a guest, like Rumi says.
Do you have a hack for that? Because this is hacking the patriarchy. Is there a way that you have come to that place that people can take from this?
Yeah, there's a lot of biohacks for that, actually. Some of my favorites are just looking up. If you're thinking about something stressful and you're looking up, it shifts the energy around that a little bit. I don't know how it works, and I can't find the actual research behind that. I saw that in a professional development on hypnosis that I did a couple months ago. But yeah, so looking up, making sure that you're taking deep breaths. One of the things that I used to use with my students, because my background's in education, is doing the finger breathing, where you inhale as you move one finger up another finger on your opposite hand. You inhale, and then you exhale as you move that finger down the other side of that finger. For folks who are listening to this and not watching, I know that didn't make any sense, but you essentially move from your pinky to your thumb, going up and down each finger, inhaling and exhaling. One inhale and exhale per finger. And the reason why I recommend that one to adults is that it's easy to do underneath a table if you're talking to somebody, and it also activates all of those nerve endings in your fingers, and so it's distracting, especially for people who are neurodivergent, and so it's distracting you from that thing that you are feeling afraid of. There's a lot of research coming out about the vagus nerve, and so it's this big nerve that runs down the sides of your neck and wraps around your gut, which is why we get butterflies when we feel nervous. And one of the easiest ways to activate the vagus nerve is humming. So humming can help release anxiety. Tapping does as well, because that is part of bilateral stimulation, if you want something to Google. And so tapping on the wide parts of your eyebrows, the outsides of your eye sockets, underneath your nose, your like soul patch area underneath your lips, and on your collarbones, and just cycling through that type of bilateral stimulation will calm you down as well. And then if we look at the top 3 things that have positive outcomes for folks with depression, number 3 is therapy and medication. Number 2 is walking. And number 1 is dancing. And so now is the time for us to get out, to build community, to walk with friends, to dance with friends, because it's for our mental health.
Brilliant, brilliant. Let's go back a little bit, because I did mention privilege, which I want to kind of look at this podcast from that place of where does it fit in? Where does it fit in with the state of the world? Where does it fit in with efforts, especially being a white passing woman hosting a show about hacking the patriarchy? Where does that fit into the big picture? Kind of, you have been my first guest, you have become a close friend, kind of where you might even see that.
I think historically, feminist movements have not done a great job of honoring intersectionality. If we look at 3 or 4 different waves of feminism, they've really centered white privilege and white women in particular, and also seemed to kind of leverage white rage. And so white women were really upset that black men had the right to vote before white women did, and so that informed a lot of the suffrage movement and the movement of not allowing indigenous or black women to vote along with white women. So keeping in mind that, like, and then regionally too, right? So Raven and I are both located in North Carolina, which has its own history of apartheid and, again, intersectional oppression. And so making sure that we as white women now keep in mind that our Latina sisters and community, they are experiencing incredible stress right now. If they come from mixed documented families, black women are still, like, you carry racism in your body. So immigrants from Africa, like first generation moms, don't have the same negative health outcomes as black women who have been here, even first generation immigrants who have been here for a generation. You tend to have lower birth rate, your kids aren't as healthy because of the way that we carry racism and oppression in our bodies. And so keeping in mind that when we have access to spaces, making sure that we keep the door open behind us, that we are being humble and listening and entering in movements that are already in progress. Because I think for white women in particular, it's really easy to say, oh, I didn't see this coming. We're the only ones who didn't. Because we, at least in the South, still have very segregated communities where you have people from the same town who have different dialects because of the spaces that they move in. And so recognizing that, like, part of creating a white identity is moving through these phases of, like, I don't see race, or everybody wants to be like me, or what are you? Where are you from? To finally abolition and shifting even from being an ally to being an accomplice. It's being willing to put our bodies and our careers on the line in order to make sure that we are acting in solidarity, complete solidarity with other femme identifying folks who are experiencing this administration in a different way than we are.
Gosh, I mean, we could have a whole conversation on that alone. It takes a lot to step back and think, am I part of the problem? To know that I'm part of the problem, how can I not be part of the problem? It's a lot of work, which also brings me to the question, my next question. Actually, that was a perfect dovetail into my next question, which is about being overwhelmed. So this happened the last time Trump took office. I wanted to do as much as possible, but I also became so overwhelmed. I probably spent at least a week in analysis paralysis, if not more. And how do we advocate? How do we go alongside people? How do we do the work when there is so much work to be done?
I think part of that is recognizing that, like, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And so really staying within our zone of genius. So, like, not just the things that we can do well, but also the things that give back to us. So you can't pour from an empty cup. So being engaged in that type of activism that also fills your cup, and recognizing that, like, true advocacy doesn't mean that you're on the field for the entire game. It's stepping in and stepping off so that you can rest, so that we can play the long game, because we're going to be here for a while. I just heard this today. They're already introducing legislation to make it possible for a president to have a third term, just not consecutive. Right. And so it's like a big joke around late night comedians that are saying, like, well, we've got like around 1,500 days left. I mean, it might not be. And so keeping that in mind, making sure that your body's taken care of, making sure that your spirit is taken care of, allowing yourself that space to hop off the field for a minute so that you can put your best self on the field, and recognizing that we don't, like, if you're looking at an apocalyptic situation, it's not about buying a bunch of land and homesteading. It's about mutual aid and community activism. And so making sure that we stay surrounded by a community that reflects our values and is, like Killer Mike is saying, it's strategizing, organizing, and mobilizing. But also making sure that, white people have a weak spot for, like, doing some white saviorism. And so recognizing when we're in those spaces, when we have a temptation to do that, and making sure that we're listening first and stepping in where our skills are needed and not taking over, not dominating these spaces, not telling people that we know how to do things best. There was an excellent blog about white identity. I can look it up and send it to you so we can drop it in the session notes. But I was really dragged through that whole article about how white people love to tell poor people how to be poor, because this is one of the intersectionalities that I think a lot of white folks hold is, I can't have privilege, I grew up poor. There's a lot of different intersectionality in poverty as well. And so just making sure that we listen first and act second.
Yeah.
How does activism show up for you in this space, or how are you envisioning this time for you being different than the last administration?
Oof, that's like a loaded question. I don't know that I've given it enough thought. Hopefully this podcast is one. It didn't exist during the last administration, and I don't know that, I know that I wasn't in a place to do it, or I probably would have done it, but here we are. So this is one. I would like to get involved more on a local level, because I also didn't live here during the last administration. So I was in Texas, which, dare I say, I don't know, might be worse. So just kind of looking at that, I want to get involved on a local level, and I want to do things that are uncomfortable. I want to meet people that make me uncomfortable. I want to have conversations that are uncomfortable for the sake of being curious and learning. Maybe, donate some money.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a very white woman thing to say.
Yeah, but also organizations need money, and that's honestly one of the most empowering things that we can do for organizations. So like beyond volunteering for a food bank or donating like old cans that you have that you weren't going to eat anyway, these organizations need money. And there's like a whole rabbit hole of philanthropy where you are engaging in active oppression during the day, but then using the money that you've made at night to engage in philanthropy so that you can still control how money and how dismantling systems of oppression work in the evening.
God, I want you to do that one again. Say that again, because that was mind blown. So true. My goodness.
So we also can't ignore the philanthropy industrial complex, where you have people who are part of organizations who are engaged in active oppression during the day, and then they flip it around and engage in philanthropy at night. And so you look at these nonprofits who are always strapped for cash and always going after the same grants, that really the most empowering thing that you can do for these organizations is trust how they spend their money and send them the money that they need to engage in the work that is important to them, because these organizations have been in the works and on the ground for decades. Just because we didn't know about them or just because also they get silenced or there's active work against what they're trying to do in the community, doesn't mean that they haven't already been doing this work and have much more knowledge about community networks than we have. And so like Student U in Durham is one of the great ones that has groups that are for white people to help white people better understand the socioeconomic context that's in Durham, that's on like a local level and a national level. And I learned so much from doing that program several years ago. I'm sure that they have other rounds. That was during the pandemic, but I'm sure they have new rounds now. And so like as white people, what I try to keep in mind, or as a white person, what I try to keep in mind in every space that I'm in is who is here, who is missing, what voices are being amplified, and what voices are being silenced. I think it's one thing that I know I had growing up. It's like, oh, we need to give voice to the voiceless. We need to make sure that we're interrupting systems of oppression by making sure that people's voices are being heard. But that's not the case. It's that people's voices are actively being silenced. And so if I find myself with the mic, I pass it and make sure that I pass it to somebody else who's already doing this work and much more knowledgeable in this area than I am.
Thank you for that. Because we talked about this in episode 1, and I don't think I asked you, like, you're taking stock, what's next? So it's passing it or getting someone involved that needs to be kind of filling in the blank spots. You mentioned something I want to dive into a little bit, and I don't even know if this is something we should be talking about, that you feel comfortable talking about, but you mentioned trust and what we are receiving from all the different places we get our information in regards to media is at this point questionable. I mean, what Meta peeled back fact checking, Twitter has become Twitter. You just don't even know where to look. I feel like even news companies that I would say I would listen to have been silent on some things. What do you think about like trust? Where is it in community? Is it with others? Is it being curious? Is it fact checking? Where do you even fact check now? I feel like that information is being hidden. Kind of like the whole health thing, like don't talk about the bird flu. Let's bury that one.
I'm wondering if part of a way forward through this trust piece couldn't also help with some of the sense of overwhelm. I think part of the overwhelm comes from the engagement that we have with social media as well. I know that I feel worse when I'm on Twitter, when I'm on Facebook, even if it's like not just doom scrolling, but hope questing. Like I want to see like what's going on great in the lives of my friends that I don't speak to very often. It just activates my nervous system in a way that didn't happen before the pandemic or before we had access to the internet in our pockets. So I think one of the direct ways, like if we look at the apartheid South or Jim Crow laws, people didn't change because they all of a sudden grew a heart or saw these civil rights marches and movements and were like, oh my God, I can't believe that's happening. It was because we hit them in the pocketbook. Woolworth, which is located in my hometown, they changed their policy because they were losing so much money. And so Dulce Sloan just brought that up too. We have to hit these white men in the pocket where it hurts. And so one of the ways that we can actively do that if we choose to continue to engage in social media is downloading an ad blocker and accessing it from Safari or whatever your web browser is instead of through their app. But thinking about like trust of information, I wonder if part of this is getting off of social media and back into print. So many people have written like long form books, long form essays, diving back into authors who not just lived through moments of oppression, but come from those oppressed identities. How did they survive? How did they thrive? How did they do so, as Maya Angelou says, with grace and some style? People have been in much worse situations than what we're in right now. Who's to say by the end of this administration what state we are in, but people have lived through arguably what is much worse environments than what we are right now. And so going back and reading a book about it as opposed to staying up to date on all of the news, especially given that they are flooding on purpose. That's part of their strategy to disorient the left, to keep us fighting amongst each other, trying to cancel each other if we don't do things perfectly or make us afraid to speak up for fear of being canceled or whatever. And I think it's remembering that we are all learning, we're all growing, we're all trying to dismantle white supremacy and the patriarchy from the inside out and demonstrating a little grace. Not grace for a Nazi salute. I do not agree with what the ADL said about what we clearly saw on stage. But to your point, I think that's another way of gaslighting and throwing up dog whistles. And so just keeping our ear to the ground and our hands in community.
Yeah. Great points, because I actually had that thought this morning about the hit him with the pocketbooks, because I was actually thinking about being very, very strategic with your money is one way to protest. But going back to the gaslighting too. I saw someone say if it wasn't meant like that, the first thing someone could do is apologize. There has not been an apology. Like that's also a red flag.
And we can't ignore how much the Biden administration also gaslit people. Apparently, one of the most effective ads for Trump was Kamala Harris on loop saying that the Biden economy is working because they weren't listening to people saying how much they were struggling. And I know that Biden inherited an economy that was being impacted by a pandemic that is still ongoing and still impacting GDP with all of these people being sick and taking sick days off of work. It's having a huge impact on the economy, but the fact that they couldn't just say that because they valued the win more than listening to folks on the ground. That was one of the reasons why Trump won. And so making sure that we don't perpetuate those same things just by saying like, oh, the other side is gaslighting. Yeah, they are. How much of that is part of what's embedded in our culture right now? How do we make sure that we don't re-perpetuate that and make sure that people do feel heard? And then, like you were saying, the dog whistling is also incredibly concerning.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I didn't intend for this episode to be all politics. Obviously, you can't have a conversation about hacking the patriarchy without talking about politics, and especially the fact that we're continuing on in this time and space. But I also want to look to the future. So last year, I said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do an episode a week in 2025. I'm going to continue on this journey that when I launched, I was unsure of how far it was going to go. Looking to the future, we're going to talk about all kinds of things this year. We're going to talk about money, which I don't think I've talked about in the direct sense before. We're going to talk about fertility. We're going to talk about relationships. We're going to talk a ton about communities, but kind of getting your thoughts as someone I consider like an advisor and someone who's pretty involved with the work I do from a friend standpoint, what you would love to see, what I might miss if I'm in my own head, which I tend to do way too much anyway.
I love the topics coming up. I think they're going to be so relevant for the situation that we're living in. I'm with the shift in reproductive rights over the past several years. Who knows what the Supreme Court is going to look like after this administration, however long it is. And so just really excited to see this wonderful community that you've built and you creating this space and literally passing the mic to amplify these really important voices speaking about those issues.
And it is Hacking the Patriarchy. So I love to end every episode with 3 hacks that the listeners can use to go forth and prosper. Since this is a pretty open episode, I would say it could be anything from politics to advocacy to just getting out there having conversations. Also, I do know that you love a good book or two, so any book recommendations you have.
That was literally the first one I was going to mention. So Tema Akun, who's actually from Chapel Hill, wrote this great book as part of her dissertation called The Emperor Wears No Clothes or something like that. And it's all about how white people create that sense of identity. Most of the new clients that I have, if I ask them about their cultural background, if they're white, they'll say, oh, I didn't really have any. And that's because it's hard to tell the temperature of the water that you're swimming in, because what's normal for you has been normalized for everybody else. And so Tema Akun is one of the first ones that I would recommend. And then I would say, listen. We have to listen first, because we are the only ones who did not know, we as white people did not know that we were this close to a Trump presidency. And so listening to authors, listening to community members, being involved as a participant rather than a leader in these spaces where appropriate, and remembering that in order to be sustainable, we have to tap into our sense of joy, because no one benefits from our fear, no one benefits from our stress, no one benefits from our anxiety. We don't show that we're a better ally by being so stressed out about everything. We show that we're an accomplice by getting our hands dirty, being on the ground with these folks, putting ourselves between people who hold identities that would be more dangerous or threatened if we are marching, demonstrating, and then most of all, using your money strategically. Because if that's one thing that we know that this administration is going to try to do, it's make a whole bunch of people really rich. And so buying local, supporting other folks, and keeping in mind that we are designed to be social creatures. We're not supposed to go off into the woods and do our own thing. We need mutual aid. And so really doing that self-reflective piece, going into these spaces and listening, acting within your zone of genius, and cultivating that sense of joy from within.
And for anyone tuning in who wants to reach out, get to know you, where would they find you?
So you can find me on my website, dawnbowes.com, Dawn like the soap, B as in boy, OWES as in Sam.com. I've got a digital course coming out this year about how to reclaim your time for folks who want a shorter experience of how to recover from burnout, doing everything from the biohacking that we were talking about before, exploring ways to hack your vagus nerve, hack your breath, your body chemistry, and practical things like how do I make time to answer all these emails, make sure that I'm living the life that I want to live really intentionally and fully. So that is coming out. Feel free to be in touch. I love having these types of conversations, but you can find everything on my website. That is dawnbowes.com.
That is actually really relevant and really timely. I feel, given, depending on when you release it, given the time frame, it is going to be really relevant. I think a lot of us are going to be burned out very soon. Having access to that is going to be wonderful. Dawn, it is always a pleasure. I love chatting with you, no matter the topic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. You are always such a joy to speak with, and I'm excited to go through this administration with really powerful, authentic women like yourself. It's an honor to know you.
Same. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's episode. For all the juicy deets on this episode, be sure to check out our show notes or give us a holler on Instagram at Hacking the Patriarchy Podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, don't be shy. Please share it with your friends. Sharing is caring after all. Lastly, if you'd like to lend your personal support, please take a moment to tell the world about it with a review on your favorite streaming platform. We'd be forever grateful. Tune in again soon to enjoy a brand new episode of the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. And until next time, keep on hacking, my friends.